The air on the 60th floor of Vanguard and Sterling always tasted of ozone, expensive cologne, and palpable desperation. My name is Leo, and until 3 months ago, I was just another anonymous intern grinding his youth into dust at Wall Street's most prestigious, cutthroat investment bank. We were the bottom feeders in a terrifying corporate ecosystem, expected to work 100-hour weeks, sustain ourselves on black coffee, and possess the emotional resilience of a brick wall. The marble floors of the skyscraper felt less like a foundation, and more like an altar where junior analysts were sacrificed daily to the gods of capital. But the true terror of Vanguard and Sterling wasn't the hours or the impossible workloads. It was Julian. Julian, the president and CEO. At 32, he was a financial prodigy, a man who had built his empire on aggressive short-selling and ruthless corporate acquisitions. He was devastatingly handsome in a cold, statuesque way, sharp jaw, piercing dark eyes, always clad in bespoke Italian suits that draped over his broad shoulders like modern armor. But beneath that flawless exterior was a tyrant who ruled the trading floor with a zero-tolerance policy for human error. The humiliation from yesterday afternoon still burned a hole in my chest. It had been a routine quarterly profit modeling review. I had spent 72 straight hours organizing the data, verifying the spreadsheets until my vision blurred. But the model contained a flaw. It wasn't entirely my error. A senior analyst had fed me a corrupted data packet at the 11th hour. But when Julian cornered me in the glass-walled conference room, excuses were irrelevant. 3 data errors, 2 broken logic chains. Julian's voice hadn't been loud. It never was. It was a low, lethal hum that carried effortlessly through the glass walls, ensuring everyone on the floor could hear my execution. "I ask for perfection, Leo. You give me a liability," Julian had said, his eyes scanning the printed dossier in his hands with undisguised disgust. "Are you here to waste everyone's time, or just mine?" Before I could force a stuttering apology through my frozen vocal cords, Julian had simply let go of the binder. It hit the edge of the mahogany table, snapping open and sending 200 pages of painstakingly printed data scattering across the plush gray carpet like dead leaves. "Pick it up, do it over, or don't come back tomorrow," he had commanded, turning his back on me to gaze out at the Manhattan skyline. 12 people. 12 senior analysts, vice presidents, and fellow interns had watched through the glass as I dropped to my hands and knees, my face burning with a shame so hot it brought tears to my eyes. I scrambled across the floor, gathering the scattered documents, my fingers trembling. Not a single person moved to help me. In Julian's empire, you didn't step in front of the firing squad to save a dead man. I felt utterly, entirely useless. Hours later, the sun had set, and the glittering, unforgiving Manhattan skyline had given way to the grime and shadows of my cramped Brooklyn apartment. The radiator hissed in the corner, offering a pathetic excuse for heat, but as I collapsed onto my worn-out sofa, my heart rate finally began to slow. I pulled out my phone, trading the hellscape of high finance for a jar of digital sweets. I opened the encrypted messaging app. The familiar chat interface loaded, and there it was, a lifeline waiting for me in the dark. "Leo, that tyrant yelled at me again today, in front of everyone. I made a mistake, but he didn't have to humiliate me. I don't think I can survive in this industry. I'm so useless." I stared at the blinking cursor, my thumb hovering over the screen, feeling pathetic for dumping my trauma on him. But within seconds, the typing bubble appeared. "Mr. Eclipse, you are not useless, little fish. Your boss is a tyrant who uses fear to compensate for whatever is missing in his own miserable life. Don't let him in your head. You are brilliant. I'm right here. Take a deep breath." A heavy, shuddering breath escaped my lungs. Mr. Eclipse, he was my online boyfriend of exactly 1 year. We had met on an anonymous forum for young professionals dealing with corporate burnout. We bonded over our mutual hatred for toxic work cultures, our shared neurotic tendencies, and a surprisingly similar dark sense of humor. We had never met in person, had never even exchanged real names or photos beyond abstract shots of our hands or morning coffees, but he was the anchor keeping me tethered to my sanity. "Mr. Eclipse, I'll order you some real food tomorrow, no cheap takeout. You need to eat well to fight the dragon. I'll take care of you, okay?" Tears, the ones I had stubbornly refused to shed in the conference room, finally slipped down my cheeks. It was an absurd parallel universe I was living in. Trampled beneath a demon's Oxford shoes by day, I was cradled in an angel's digital palm by night. "Leo, thank you. I wish you were here. Mr. Eclipse, me too. Soon, I promise." Now, close your eyes. Tomorrow is a new day. I held the phone to my chest, closing my eyes and letting his words wash over me. My life was divided by an impassable wall, hell on one side, a sanctuary of absolute sweetness on the other. My only consolation as I drifted off to an exhausted sleep was the absolute concrete certainty that these two worlds, the sadistic CEO who wanted to crush my spirit and the endlessly patient online confidant who wanted to mend it, would never ever collide. The fallout from the conference room scandal was immediate the next morning. I had boarded the subway at dawn, assuming the best strategy was to keep my head down, stick to the shadows, and pray Julian had moved on to a new victim. Instead, the tempest swallowed me whole the second I stepped off the elevator. The whispers on the trading floor were thick enough to cut with a knife. As I walked to my cubicle, conversations abruptly stopped. Eyes darted toward me, filled with a sickening mix of pity and morbid curiosity. "Have you heard?" A junior trader whispered to the girl next to him, loud enough for me to catch. "The intern who got yelled at until he cried yesterday? He got transferred." My heart plummeted. Fired, they were going to fire me. Transferred where? The mailroom? Straight to the president's office. Personal assistant. I stopped dead in my tracks. The girl gasped. "Julian's assistant? But he hasn't had one last longer than 3 weeks. Why him?" Probably afraid yesterday's scolding wasn't satisfying enough, the trader sneered quietly. "He wants to keep the kid under his nose to torment him slowly, like a cat playing with a half-dead mouse." My stomach turned over violently. A personal assistant to the CEO. On paper, it was a massive promotion, a direct line to the top of the firm. But every instinct in my body screamed that this was a one-way ticket to purgatory. I was marched up to the glass-walled executive suite by an apologetic-looking HR director. Julian's office was a massive, sterile expanse of white marble, black leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. It felt less like a workspace and more like an operating theater. Julian was standing by the window, reviewing a tablet. He didn't look up when I entered. "Why are you standing so far away?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. He pointed to a small, sleek desk situated in the far corner of the room, completely devoid of any personal touches. "Your desk is over there." I swallowed hard, my knuckles turning white around the strap of my messenger bag. "Yes, sir. Finish organizing the Q3 asset restructuring files by the end of today," he commanded, finally turning his dark, impenetrable eyes onto me. "One wrong punctuation mark in the format, and you redo the entire 1,000-page stack. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Julian. Get to work." I sat at my new desk, my hands shaking as I booted up the computer. The mental torture was insidious. He didn't need to shout. He just sat at his massive desk, an apex predator watching my every microscopic move. I learned quickly that being his assistant meant measuring even my breathing in decibels. "The temperature?" Julian murmured 2 hours later, not looking away from his monitor. "I want it at exactly 68 degrees. It feels like 70. I scrambled to the digital thermostat, adjusting it with trembling fingers. A little later, I brought him his requested glass of water. He took a sip, paused, and set it down with a sharp clack against the coaster. "This water is at most 60 degrees. I prefer room temperature. Redo it." I stared at him, genuinely terrified. I started to suspect his tongue had a built-in thermometer. I took the glass back, my resentment boiling just beneath the surface. "You capitalist bloodsucker," I thought bitterly as I stood in the executive pantry, staring at the water cooler. People who exploit others like this deserve to grow old and die completely alone. When I returned to the office, he had already moved on to destroying my formatting. "Page 3, second paragraph," he said, tapping a pen against the desk. "The logic chain is broken. The font in the footnote isn't consistent with the corporate style guide. Do it over." He didn't yell. He just uttered those 3 soul-crushing words. Do it over. By 8 p.m., I was the only person left on the floor besides him. My eyes were burning, my back aching, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I sneaked a glance under the desk. "Mr. Eclipse, delivery is at your door. You told me you'd be working late. Don't starve." I felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. I was stuck here, trapped by a demon, while an angel was trying to feed me from afar. I texted my landlord to bring the food inside for me, apologizing to Mr. Eclipse that my boss was holding me hostage. Looking up, I saw Julian rubbing his temples, a rare flicker of fatigue crossing his perfect features. At that moment, I didn't realize the massive, world-shattering coincidence playing out right in front of me. I had absolutely no idea that the man pushing me to the brink of a nervous breakdown during the day and the man showering me with love at night were sitting in the exact same room. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of sophisticated psychological torture. Julian never raised his voice, but his presence in the president's office was like a black hole, draining all the oxygen from the room. I learned to measure my every breath, the slightest error, a misplaced comma in a financial report, a cup of coffee off by a few degrees, was met with 3 razor-sharp words: "Do it over." My only solace came at night, curled up in my rundown Brooklyn apartment, my phone screen glowing with messages from Mr. Eclipse. He patiently listened to my complaints about the tyrant, sent sweet words of encouragement, and occasionally shared photos of his morning coffee or dinner. But then, the breadcrumbs of coincidence began to appear, scratching at the boundary between my two worlds. It started with the artificial sweetener. I had been trying to cut back on sugar, but the bitter office coffee was unbearable. In a night of desperate need for empathy, I texted Mr. Eclipse, confessing a quirky habit. I had found a monk fruit sweetener, but my obsessive-compulsive tendencies dictated that I use exactly half a packet per cup. I joked that I must be the only person in New York City with such a ridiculous compulsion. Mr. Eclipse didn't laugh. He simply teased, asking if I was a Virgo, and said those little quirks made me genuine and adorable. The next morning, I stood in the executive pantry, preparing Julian's espresso. Suddenly, he appeared in the doorway, casually adjusting his cufflinks. Without looking at me, his voice as flat as a frozen lake, he demanded I use the new monk fruit sweetener the company had just stocked, emphasizing, "Use exactly half a packet." The air rushed out of my lungs. Julian wasn't smiling. He didn't look like he was joking. But those 3 variables, the specific monk fruit sweetener, the exact half-packet measurement, and my Virgo zodiac sign that I had accidentally let slip in my HR file, collided in my mind like a freight train. There were 8 million people in New York. The probability of 2 strangers sharing such a bizarrely specific habit was astronomical. But looking at the emotionless, ruthless CEO before me, I frantically dismissed the thought. Mr. Eclipse was warm and gentle. Julian was a cold-blooded capitalist machine, 2 parallel lines and could never intersect. Yet once the seed of doubt was planted, my eyes began to betray my logic. The following week, the suspicion shifted to a tie. It was a dark, woven navy silk with silver stripes so fine they were nearly invisible from a distance. Mr. Eclipse had once sent me a torso shot before attending a charity gala, complaining about the dress code. The tie in the photo had the exact same sheen and fabric structure, with the stripes leaning slightly to the left. That day, as Julian stood by the window reviewing an acquisition contract, I approached him, clutching a file, my heart hammering against my ribs. In a moment of sheer, reckless stupidity, I closed the distance between us, lying that I wanted to check if his tie pin was crooked, just to get a closer look at the fabric. The masculine scent of vetiver and cedarwood hit my senses. Julian immediately stepped back, his eyes cold enough to freeze hell over. He gritted out every syllable, informing me that he never wore a tie pin, turning my lie into a pathetic farce. He ordered me to step back and get out, his tone dripping with disdain for anyone daring to invade his personal space. But in the fraction of a second as I retreated, I saw it. Tucked just beneath his sharp jawline, right below his ear, was a small, light brown mole. The world went entirely silent. The hum of the air conditioning vanished. The M&A file in my hands felt like lead. The man in Mr. Eclipse's photo, though only showing a fraction of his jaw, had the exact same mole in the absolute same position. I fled the office, locking myself in a bathroom stall, gasping for air. Panic and hope churned into an untangleable mess. I needed incontrovertible proof. The coincidences were terrifying, but I refused to jump off a cliff without a parachute. Mr. Eclipse carried a bizarre genetic trait. He harbored a deep, burning hatred for cilantro. In our late-night chats, he once described its taste as soap mixed with despair. If Julian had no reaction to cilantro, this entire insane theory would collapse, and I could return to the life of a normal assistant. That afternoon, I ordered Julian's lunch from a high-end European bistro, a complex Caesar salad, but I left a specific note for the chef, requesting a massive amount of fresh cilantro, finely minced and hidden beneath the romaine lettuce. I sat at my desk in the corner, holding my breath as I watched Julian open the container. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Julian's face darkened, his jaw clenched, and for a split second I genuinely thought he was going to hurl the expensive glass bowl at my head. The temperature in the room plummeted below zero. He snapped his head up, his gaze ready to flay me alive, accusing me of attempting botanical assassination. He questioned my competence, berating me for being his assistant for months, and still failing to grasp the most basic dietary taboos. The threat was delivered without an ounce of mercy. If it happened again, it would be considered deliberate sabotage, and I would be thrown out immediately. Then, in suffocating silence, the powerful Wall Street CEO spent the next 15 minutes using his fork to meticulously pick out every microscopic cilantro leaf from his salad, radiating absolute fury. The phone in my pocket buzzed. "Mr. Eclipse." "Little fish, you won't believe this. My new assistant tried to assassinate me with a forest of minced cilantro today. I'm starting to suspect he secretly has a crush on me and is trying to get my attention through psychological warfare." I stared blankly at the screen. Rage and shock tore at my insides. My hands shook as I typed a reply calling him a narcissist, while my eyes remained pinned to Julian's back across the room. They were one and the same. And the monster turning my days into hell and the man gently comforting me every night resided in the same body. But my rational mind made one last, desperate struggle. I needed a definitive test, something utterly illogical and beyond prediction. That night, I proposed a secret signal to Mr. Eclipse. Just the word meow, a ridiculous, out-of-context sound. The next morning, while Julian was focused on a quarterly financial report, I walked up to his desk. Swallowing hard, I gathered all my courage and let out a small, clear meow. Julian slowly lowered the report. He didn't smile. He didn't offer any knowing wink. Instead, he looked at me with a profound, genuine concern reserved for the clinically delusional. In a deadpan tone, he asked if I needed the phone number for the company-sponsored psychiatrist. Humiliation swallowed me whole. I scrambled back to my desk, convinced I had officially lost my mind. That night, I recounted the embarrassing incident to Mr. Eclipse, and he comforted me with such authentic tenderness that all my doubts vanished entirely. Julian was Julian. Mr. Eclipse was Mr. Eclipse. I was just a paranoid intern, too desperate for a connection. Strangely, shedding that delusion made life easier. I stopped looking for ghosts. I focused on doing my job well, learning to anticipate Julian's needs before he even spoke. I matched his insane work pace, and slowly, the ice in the president's office began to thaw. I even started to admire his decisive brilliance. He wasn't a monster. He was just a lonely man carrying the weight of a billion-dollar empire on his shoulders. The fragile peace on Wall Street is always just a prelude to a storm. It hit on a Tuesday morning, during an emergency board meeting on risk control. Trent, the senior analyst who had always been bitter about my sudden promotion to the executive suite, stood before the projector screen looking grave. He announced that the core data report for the upcoming quarterly fundraising had been permanently deleted from the server at exactly 11:13 p.m. the previous night. All eyes turned to the screen. The access logs didn't lie. The account used to execute the deletion was mine. My throat burned with a bitter taste. Panic seized me as I stammered, trying to explain that I was on the subway home at that time, that I had left the building by 10 p.m. I looked to Julian at the head of the table, desperately seeking trust, a sliver of the camaraderie we had built over the past few weeks. But Julian looked back at me, his face an impenetrable mask of ice. There was no belief, nor was there doubt. There was only the cold, calculating gaze of a CEO assessing a threat to his company. Without a moment of hesitation, Julian announced my immediate suspension pending investigation. His voice echoed through the massive boardroom, ordering me to hand over my access card in front of the entire board of directors, stripping me of all system privileges. Trembling, I unclipped the lanyard from my neck and placed it on the table. I had hoped he would ask me at least one question, give me one chance to defend myself, but he said nothing. His silence was my death sentence. I packed my few belongings into a cardboard box, crushed by the weight of the entire firm's contemptuous stares. Back in my freezing apartment, the injustice and humiliation broke me completely. I curled up on my torn sofa and reached for my only remaining lifeline. I texted Mr. Eclipse. Through tear-blurred eyes, I screamed through the keyboard that my boss was a blind, cold-blooded bastard, begging for the comfort only he could provide. I couldn't bear communicating through lifeless text lines anymore. "Leo, I need to hear your voice. Please. You're the only one who believes me." A beat of time passed, And then, out in the dingy hallway of the apartment building, a phone began to ring. It wasn't a normal ringtone. It was a custom, highly specific audio clip I had forced Mr. Eclipse to set exclusively for my contact profile as a joke months ago. I froze. The ringing continued, echoing through the thin wooden door. I dropped my phone, walking toward the door like a condemned man approaching the gallows. I turned the knob and pulled the door wide open. Under the flickering fluorescent lights of the cheap apartment corridor, Julian stood there. He was wearing a bespoke suit worth more than my annual salary, staring down at the glowing screen of his phone. On his screen, the caller ID flashed the name, Little Fish. Everything in my universe collapsed and reshaped itself in sheer, agonizing pain. The man who called me his little fish, the man who promised to protect me in the darkest nights, was the exact same man who had stripped me of my dignity in front of dozens of people just hours ago. The betrayal was absolute. Seeing me, Julian's mask finally shattered. The coldness vanished, replaced by sheer desperation. He took a step forward, reaching out to touch me, calling my name and trying to explain. But I recoiled as if burned by a red-hot iron. I screamed at him, cursing him for treating me like a lab rat in his psychological experiments, playing with my feelings for sport. Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. He tried to explain that the public suspension was a tactical move. He needed to appease the board to buy time to secretly extract the security footage and trap Trent, the man who had stolen and cloned my keycard. But I didn't care about corporate espionage. I didn't care about Wall Street politics. All I cared about was that he stood by and watched me bleed out in front of the entire company without saying a single word to defend me. I slammed the door shut and locked the deadbolt. That night, I blocked every channel of communication with Mr. Eclipse. I hated him for the deception, but I hated myself 1,000 times more for having fallen in love with both versions of him. Chapter 5: The Power Inversion and the Michelin Apology. The next morning, the atmosphere at Vanguard and Sterling had entirely shifted. My suspension was lifted before 9 a.m. The security footage had exposed Trent. He was stripped of all core projects and exiled to a windowless cubicle. Julian hadn't fired him yet. He was saving the kill shot. When I walked back into the president's office, a switch inside me had permanently flipped. The trembling, obedient intern died the night before. When Julian slid a stack of financial documents across the desk, asking me to take them down to the Treasury Department, I didn't take them. I just stood there, looking straight into his eyes, my voice entirely flat, and refused. A week ago, this insubordination would have been career suicide. But now, Julian simply lowered his pen slowly. His eyes carried a heavy mix of longing and guilt. He compromised. He agreed to deliver the documents himself, on one singular condition. I had to sit on the leather sofa in his office and never leave his line of sight while he worked. The power dynamic had completely inverted. I was no longer the prey. I was holding the leash. The office drama reached its climax during the lunch hour. Trent, driven mad by his demotion, cornered me in the empty elevator lobby. He sneered, loudly mocking that I survived the data scandal solely because of my face and body, implying with vulgar words that I was providing the CEO with services not outlined in my employment contract. He reached out, grabbing my shoulder to shove me. Before I could react, Julian was there. The temperature in the hallway dropped to freezing. Julian didn't shout. He didn't need to raise his voice. With a low, gravelly tone containing pure violence, he slapped Trent's hand away from me, coldly asking where he found the nerve to lay his filthy hands on his person. The word partner echoed between the marble walls. Julian fired Trent on the spot. With the voice of a ruthless sovereign, he swore to use every ounce of his power to ensure that bastard would never find employment even scrubbing toilets at any financial institution on Wall Street. But publicly claiming territory apparently wasn't enough to make amends. The following day, the executive suite was overtaken by a man in a pristine white chef's coat, the 3 Michelin star head chef of the legendary Le Bernardin. The chef respectfully placed a custom-designed lunch on my desk, bowing and announcing that Mr. Julian had specifically emphasized absolutely not a single leaf of cilantro. I looked up. Julian was leaning against the doorframe, watching me with a vulnerability he never showed in the daylight. He confessed, loud enough for 6 passing executives to hear, that he would be covering my lunches for the rest of his life. The food was truly a culinary masterpiece, but I stubbornly refused to forgive him immediately. I was still angry, it's just that I was... genuinely too hungry to turn down that black truffle mushroom risotto. The boundary between the cold-blooded CEO and the gentle boyfriend crumbled at breakneck speed. During a tense board meeting regarding a $12 billion merger, I accidentally flipped to the wrong page of the presentation 3 times. The reason wasn't my lack of focus. It was because, beneath the massive mahogany conference table, Julian's expensive leather shoe was relentlessly rubbing against my ankle, caressing my calf, sending electric shocks up my spine that made it impossible to breathe evenly. When I pulled him into a blind spot after the meeting to scold him for workplace harassment, Julian just looked at me with dark, intense eyes, calmly replying that sitting next to me without being able to touch me was a challenge that exceeded his body's physical limits. His possessiveness manifested in insane ways. He was ready to glare down any male analyst who dared stop at my desk for more than 5 seconds, threatening to cut the entire IT department's bonuses if they made me laugh with their dry jokes. My final defensive wall completely collapsed after the company's team-building party. That night, I drank way too much. The alcohol dissolved all my inhibitions. I got completely wasted and started rambling in front of my dumbfounded colleagues that their terrifying president was actually a jealous freak who liked to play footsie under the table. Julian had to personally come and extract me. In the car, I slumped against his shoulder, crying and whining that I didn't know what to do because I accidentally fell in love with both my annoying boss and the internet boyfriend who sent me 6-pack abs photos to seduce me. I woke up the next morning in Julian's luxurious penthouse. My head pounded like a jackhammer, and my body ached as if I had been run over by a massive truck multiple times. Julian, wearing a loosely tied silk robe, stood crossing his arms in the bedroom doorway, watching me with the satisfied gaze of a wild beast that had just eaten its fill. He didn't give me a chance to hide in embarrassment. With a voice blending a CEO's authority and deep love, he informed me that last night I had cried and demanded he take responsibility. Therefore, he had dispatched a moving crew to clear out my terrible Brooklyn apartment. All my clothes, books, and even my embarrassing anime figurine collection were currently being unboxed right in his guest room. I panicked and protested, saying everything was moving too fast, that we had only known each other's true identities for less than a month. Julian walked over, pinning me against the mattress. He whispered that we had loved each other online for a year, that he would never accept waking up in the morning without seeing me in his line of sight for another day. He pointed toward a walk-in closet as big as a department store, generously declaring, "I'm giving you half the closet. If you want, you can have all of it as long as you stay here." I groaned, burying my face in the pillows, hopelessly surrendering to his undeniable dominance. Chapter 7. Welcome to the billionaire's orbit. The first weekend after I officially moved in, Julian's concept of resting was dragging me into an armored SUV and driving straight to his family's sprawling estate in the suburbs. There was no heads up, no negotiation. He simply announced to his billionaire parents, "This is my partner." I had braced myself for a dramatic check-throwing eviction scene like in a soap opera, but instead they practically sobbed with relief. Julian had lived like an emotionless work machine for a decade. They were overjoyed to see he finally had human emotions. His mother, an elegant matriarch, smiled and pressed a folder into my hands. It contained the property deeds to 3 luxury apartments in Manhattan, 2 villas on the Upper East Side, along with the keys to 2 limited edition supercars. She called it a little welcome gift to the family. I almost fainted at the sheer magnitude of the wealth and firmly tried to refuse. But Julian just wrapped an arm tightly around my waist, whispering in my ear that for his family, having someone willing to take their workaholic, difficult son off their hands was a far better bargain than a few blocks of real estate. Julian's wealth and power swept me into an entirely different world. He ordered all schedules canceled, including a crucial board meeting, just to pull me onto a private jet worth tens of millions of dollars. The destination was his private island in the Caribbean. On the pristine white sand under a sky full of stars, Julian pulled me into his arms, apologizing for all the tears he had made me shed. He promised that when we returned to New York, he would officially announce me to the world. He wanted everyone to know I was his. But the reality of Wall Street never allows fairy tales to last too long. We had been back in New York for less than 24 hours when Vanguard and Sterling was ambushed. An alliance of rival hedge funds had exploited Julian's absence to launch a massive short-selling attack. They spread fake rumors about the company committing financial fraud, triggering an SEC investigation. Right at the opening bell, our stock price went into freefall, evaporating $5 billion in market capitalization. The man who had just been walking with me on a romantic beach transformed back into a demon of war. Julian locked himself in his office, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, his bloodshot eyes frantically searching for a way to stop his empire from bleeding out. After 3 days of watching him stay awake all night, I couldn't sit in the safe zone anymore. I wasn't just his lover, I was the one who designed the company's risk data analysis models. I hacked directly into the internal trading flow data. Using the analytical skills I once used to process tens of thousands of boring metrics, I found the enemy's fatal flaw. They were using triple leverage to short the stock, but their margin capital was spread far too thin across multiple brokerages. If we gathered all our available cash and pushed the stock price up by 15% in the first hour of trading, the automated systems of those brokerages would trigger a margin call, forced liquidation. They would be forced to buy back the stock at any price to cut their losses, creating a chain reaction of price surges that would crush them into dust. But we needed $1.2 billion in cash to spark that fire. The board of directors was in a panic. They didn't trust any crazy schemes. Instead, they issued an ultimatum. The Weber family, an old money dynasty, agreed to inject $3 billion to save the company, with the sole condition that Julian had to agree to an engagement with the Weber heiress. I stood at the back of the boardroom, my hands gripping the data report tightly. The board looked at me like I was an invisible wall. Julian glanced at the marriage contract on the table, then looked up at me. I didn't back down. I strode forward, slamming the data analysis report down in the middle of the mahogany table. With a steel in my voice I never knew I possessed, I exposed all the predatory clauses in the Weber contract and presented my short squeeze plan. We had $1.5 billion in liquid reserves. We didn't need a political marriage, we just needed to stab the enemy right in the throat. The entire boardroom fell dead silent. A lowly assistant had just unmasked the oldest financial minds in the room. Julian looked at me, a slow, deadly, yet fiercely proud smile spreading across his lips. The next morning, 30 minutes before the market opened, the room was so quiet you could hear heartbeats. Right as the bell rang, Julian ordered the execution. $1 billion was thrown straight into the market. The stock price jerked, rising 3%, then 7%. The rival faction frantically poured more borrowed money to suppress the price. Julian just coldly crossed his arms, letting them dig their own graves deeper. When the surge hit 11%, panic set in, and when the number crossed 15%, the brokerage's automated systems mercilessly executed the rival faction. Cross-margin liquidations were triggered. They were forced to buy in at exorbitant prices to cover their debts. In just 3 days, not only did we recover all our losses, but Julian also seized the opportunity to swallow up the rival faction's lucrative assets. The enemy was bled dry into bankruptcy. Chapter 9, the one and only. That resounding victory was hailed by the financial press as a textbook example of currency warfare. The board quietly withdrew the Weber marriage proposal and began looking at me with awe, respecting the way I stood beside Julian. When the dust of war settled, Julian called me into his office. He leaned against his massive desk, the 1,000-pound weight finally lifted from his broad shoulders. He pulled me into his arms, breathing in the scent of my hair, teasingly asking what his brilliant lead analyst wanted for a reward. I wrapped my arms around his neck, arrogantly replying that he was my reward. A week later, the company hosted a lavish victory gala at the Pierre Hotel. It was my first time stepping into Manhattan's high society legitimately. I wore a custom-tailored tuxedo Julian had commissioned specifically for me, standing nervously by his side. A prominent socialite, the daughter of a steel billionaire, approached and smiled, asking Julian for a dance. Julian didn't flinch. He placed a large, warm hand on my waist, politely refusing her and smoothly declaring that his dance partner for the evening was already set. He led me to the center of the dance floor. He wasn't a great dancer, but his arms were really steady, guiding me step by step, as if telling me not to fear anything as long as he was there. When the song ended, Julian signaled for a microphone. The room full of billionaires and powerful politicians instantly fell dead silent. He spoke about the company's survival, about the battle they had just won. But then, his eyes locked onto mine, and every layer of cold capitalist armor melted away completely. He called me forward. In front of dozens of camera lenses, in front of the board members and New York's elite, the tyrant of Wall Street dropped to one knee on the red carpet. He declared loudly to the world that I wasn't his assistant, nor was I just the person who saved the company. I was his only love, the sole exception in his dark life. Julian looked up at me, holding a ring bearing the purest diamond, gently asking if I was willing to be his little fish for the rest of his life. My tears broke free. I said yes. The next morning, every financial paper and gossip magazine in Manhattan was flooded with news of that shocking proposal. But standing on the balcony of the sunlit penthouse, looking down at the city that had once tried to crush me, I no longer cared about the noise out there. I leaned my back against Julian's solid chest, sipping coffee sweetened with exactly half a packet of monk fruit sweetener. In this universe, the ruthless demon or the sweet angel was ultimately just the man holding me tightly, the man who belonged to me forever.